I agree fully. Isn't it even more memorable? We might remember the story of Samson more than we might remember a specific verse in Philippians, because it's easy. In fact, didn't God tell the Israelites over and over and over, tell these stories yearly? Do this feast, tell the story. Do the Passover, tell the story. He wanted everyone to remember what? What was he really wanting them to remember? These doctrines, right? His provision, His sovereignty, His love, His covenant with Israel. Every year, have this feast, tell this story. Have this feast, tell this story. Interesting, Cheryl and I went to a Greek festival up in Richmond, and we had a chance to tour an Orthodox Greek church as part of this festival. And you walk in, there's all these icons and symbols. And at first, it's kind of creepy a little bit. But as we walked the tour, they had a story and a theological reason for all of these icons. And I walked away thinking, that's fascinating. It's not necessarily idolatry, but it's the reason this is here is to remind us of, which I thought to be really, really neat. That's somewhat lost in Baptist circles. Not saying we should or shouldn't do it. We just don't have those tangible things that remind us of stories that teach doctrines. Yes, sir.
Just to add to that, I think it also illustrates, maybe demonstrates, maybe back to that idea of display, but so you get a principle of perseverance or patience or repentance, but then when you read through maybe Job, or you read through Ruth and Naomi, or you read through David, or you read through, you see what that looks like lived out. Right? So it's not just this command of do this, it's see, and so you get to see those ups and downs, right? You get to see, how can this guy called a man after God's own heart have done these horrible things, and you get to see what that life of repentance looks like, and the fruit of sin bearing from generation to generation, as well as God's faithful provision.
Man, that's so good, brother. I'm going to steal his phrase and make it my own. I love this. Looks like lived out. Man, that's a beautiful summary, isn't it? It's do not commit adultery. We can go and see what adultery looks like lived out. Pursue God and repentance. Well, that's easy to say, but now we can go to David and see what that looks like lived out. Isn't that neat? Even the emotion behind it in Psalms 51. We can go and read that and get a full emotional response of David going through that time that maybe isn't present or evident in the New Testament.
Yeah, just to make one last final hoo-ah for story form, and isn't that why God in His good grace gave us the Synoptic Gospels, right?
Yeah.
Once more we have another chunk of stories that show us God in flesh living these things out.
Isn't that so much better than a description or like, these are the 5 bullet points of Jesus' teaching? That would have been much more sterile than the story of Jesus presented in the Synoptic Gospels. That's really cool. That's really cool.
I think that's, coming from a teacher standpoint, it's way more, my students take away a lot more when we put it to real life, and bring real life into it. And I think that's what the Bible does a lot. It shows us what they really did and what real life was like and what they, what the consequences for whatever happened. So I know from a teaching standpoint, and Jesus was a teacher, so, that's why He spoke how He did. So I just think it's way easier for people to grasp what is being said if it's like brought, to real life and made, like you said, memorable, where people can remember, have something to connect it to, make a connection, like when little kids are learning to read, make a connection so that they can understand and it, adds more brain cells and that kind of thing.
That's good. It's almost like a mirror of mankind, and we all can see ourselves in some of those stories, I would hope. So in summary, doctrines displayed in story form are actual displays. Gives us a sense of what's going on. It's more fun, memorable. It explains it better. It gives us a picture of what these doctrines look like lived out. So, number 5 reads like this. The Apostle Paul had the highest regard for the Old Testament's origin. By the way, notice how he words it, the Old Testament saves souls. I think that's a poor choice of words. I would rather him say the Old Testament can make one wise unto salvation. That makes more sense to me. So I'm going to use that on the board. So he says the Apostle Paul had the highest regard for the Old Testament's origin, nature, power, and purpose. 2 Timothy 3, 16 through 17. But the Old Testament wasn't only helpful for Christian living, it gave Christian life. When Paul assured Timothy that the Holy Scriptures are able to make you wise for salvation through faith which is in Jesus Christ, he was speaking of the Old Testament. 2 Timothy 3:15. Like the New Testament, the Old Testament also saved and still saves souls through faith in the Messiah. How is that possible? It's possible because of these. It points directly to Christ with prophecies, foreshadow, types, and pictures. It presents Christian doctrine, giving us meaning to those doctrines, putting those stories in doctrine form. It relays God's moral standards. So one can come away, if viewed properly, from the Old Testament, having a sense of who Jesus the Messiah is, able to put our faith in Him, and able to understand some of these key doctrines from the Old Testament. That is fascinating. I have quoted 2 Timothy 1,000,000 times there. Never, ever really thought about the truth of what that really meant. Anybody have any thoughts on that one? Pretty fascinating principle there. So now, wouldn't this be fascinating? What if we could articulate the gospel in the Old Testament? What if we could share the gospel through the Old Testament? I think that's an endeavor worth diving into. If I teach that lesson, that will be my goal, is to be able to clearly articulate and share the gospel in the Old Testament. Part of the gospel we already go to the Old Testament for, creation and fall, right? Yes, Miss Shane?
Jesus did that on the road to Emmaus. Remember, he opened the old, they didn't have the New Testament. All they had was the Old Testament. And he took them through the scriptures and presented the gospel to them.
I don't know how you spell it. That is brilliant. Did everybody get that? Miss Sharon said that's exactly what Jesus did on the road to Emmaus. He walked them through the scriptures and enlightened them on who he was. And
Old Testament.
he didn't have Paul, right? Man, that's brilliant. In fact, there's a popular sermon preached recently that gave rise to some bickering to your point. Christianity existed before the New Testament, right? Salvation through Jesus existed before the Romans road to salvation. So, yes, sir.
Yeah, if you don't have that thought, much of the Old Testament doesn't make sense. They were looking for a Messiah.
Yeah.
There was no hope in the law. There was no hope in the sacrifice. All the hope in those things was in the one to come. And so you really have to misread and misunderstand the Old Testament. It is pointing to Christ. Christ also, I think about Sharon in John, right? Says, "Hey, all that was about me." And then Sharon said something beautiful. She said, "The gospel." And we often think of the gospel as happening after the New Testament, but it's all gospel is God's redemptive work, which began before creation. And so, one of my very favorite Bibles, I highly encourage adults to buy it. It's called the Jesus Storybook Bible. I'll use the word Bible loosely in that it's not a Genesis to Revelation. It's a kid's Bible that takes I don't know if it's 30 or 40 or 50 of the most common stories. And each story in the Old Testament shows that pointing to Christ, pointing to the one to come. Boy, that's good.
Yes, Miss Sharon.
The Old Testament points to Christ. The New Testament points back to prophecy being fulfilled. The Messiah has come. And
Yeah.
that's what it's all about. And
Man.
Jesus is in every book of the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
Every book. From Genesis 3, from Genesis 1 to Revelation, he is there. We just have to pick him out.
Mm.
But when the very first ladies' Bible study we did here was Beth Moore's Woman After God's Own Heart, and it was about the Old Testament sacrificial system and the tabernacle, and she did a drawing, and I've never forgotten it. It's still well in my mind of the Holy of Holies and all of that, and she had a cross, and how that it came out with the candelabras over here. That a cross is actually, we could just picture a cross on the floor, starting from the brazen altar right through to the Holy of Holies.
Mm.
And so the tabernacle was actually fixed on Jesus. Jesus is in the tabernacle.
Mm.
He is in the Holy of Holies. He's in every part.
That's good, man. That's good. See, I'm getting a sense just in this discussion. Isn't this God's redemptive plan, the gospel, this story, so much more grand than quoting 5 scriptures from Romans? Haven't we really missed it if we boiled this beautiful God story to, hey, here in 2 seconds, assent intellectually to these 5 truths, and then, man, it is so much more beautiful and so much more compelling, I would argue. You know, taking this beautiful story and man, I want to join God's story. I want to be part of it, don't you? That is so beautiful. So the road to Emmaus displays that. The fact that the Old Testament conclusively shows there's no hope in the law, and that this whole thing is the gospel. The whole story is God's redemptive movement toward man. So good. And we've already made this case, number 6. The Old Testament makes you appreciate the New Testament more. For all the Old Testament reveals of Jesus and of Christian doctrine and experience, we must concede that it also conceals that there's a lot of frustrating shadow, and there's unfulfilled longing and desire, and there's often something, or rather someone missing in a sense. The more we read it, the more we long for and love the incarnate Christ of the New Testament. The dawn is beautiful, but the sunrise, man, is stunning. Praise be to God. All of this anticipation and tension and desperation for the Messiah. When's the Messiah showing up? And then he did. God sent, huh?
And they didn't recognize him.
Some didn't. That's right. Some didn't recognize him. Man, that's so good. I even had a thought earlier. You were talking about John. Remember when he fed the 5,000 and they're like, oh, Moses, our father, provided for him in the wilderness. And Jesus is like, hey, I'm the bread of life. Yet another picture. He says, if you eat of me, you'll never hunger again. You'll be fully. I am the living water, he said. So Jesus, man, claimed himself to be the fulfillment of all that's needed. Isn't that amazing? It blows my mind. Yes, sir.
To illustrate what we were saying a second ago, Sharon's point, boy, that's so strong. That after all that desperation of longing, of looking, and the time of silence of God, right? That at least a good portion of God's own people, so to speak, didn't see him, right? Didn't respond to him, certainly at first. Man, what a lesson there for us. Go back to that whole manual of Christian living, and so go back to number 3, number 4. That often the way we can be praying and looking and seeking God and asking for Him to move, and yet miss Him. Yet, so just an illustration of what she's saying. far as when you zoom out, you see a clear, fuller picture, and often that's where we struggle. It's not in the super up close, it's the big picture.
Yeah, that's good.
As a new Christian, I shied away from the Old Testament because I didn't understand it. But now it's my favorite because hidden in the study of the Old Testament, I'm going, that's Jesus. You know? I mean, he just shows up so unexpectedly, all from Genesis to Malachi. And it's awesome. And you're like, hey, that scripture's already been fulfilled.
Yeah, that's good.
And it's awesome because it was written hundreds and hundreds of years before Jesus happened.
Man, that's so good.
When I've taught the Old Testament, I never had a problem relating it back to the New Testament. I mean, always, no matter, it might not be in the way I planned it, but, because I'm always looking like, how can I relate this back to Jesus? How can I show the kids and students Jesus kind of thing? But it never was a problem. It's just, he's there. It's just obvious that he's there in one way, some kind of fashion, one way or another. He's always there, And I love the Old Testament too. I mean, I just love studying the Old Testament.
Look, I would challenge you to think for a moment. What happens now in this discussion when we bring in these instances where Jesus is wrestling with the legalistic religious leaders, and when Paul is fighting with the Judaizers? Think about that. Ryan talked about zooming out and seeing the Messiah fulfilling. And then when you zoom back in, that's when, think how silly it is with this perspective that someone would say, oh, you got to be circumcised. Jesus is like, man, you guys are so far off from the truth. It's about grace through God's Son who is in front of you right now. I mean, isn't that amazing? That how futile that argument is. But it's this idea of holding on to the law. That if I can do and check off, rather than acknowledging the presence and the fulfillment of all that in Jesus. Isn't it just drastic differences of viewpoint?
Man, the way you just said that, light bulb went off. You said not holding on to the law. Man, I think one of the other misconceptions we have is that this idea of holding on to the law somehow died after Jesus was born, right? But that was just a problem with the Old Testament people, this struggle with the law. But the reality is that's the state of our heart, right?
It is.
There's a bentness towards being right based on our own merit, right? We inherited it from grandma and grandpa, Adam and Eve. And so another lesson that we learn there is that same struggle is still present.
And you know what's interesting, just to tag on to that, what I saw, what you'll see in the New Testament is the Jewish people arguing on the merit of their forefathers. They would do too. It's the merit of me, our father Abraham. And Jesus is like, look, before Abraham was, I am. It's like they had that national just pride. They thought based on their own genetic makeup and DNA, they were somehow worthy of being in communion or being saved or redeemed.
Realized that God had set them apart. They were His special people. And so here they thought that they had this special right because they were of the Hebrew.
Yeah.
And so He said, "You are my special people." On what condition, though? That they kept His laws.
Yeah.
He said, I will prosper you, I will be with you always, as long as you stay faithful to me. That's how come they went to Assyria and to Babylon, because they no longer adhered to God's laws.
Yes, very good. I want to offer just a concluding remark, and it has to do with this. I'm not sure why it popped in my head. Oftentimes, people will think people in the Old Testament were somehow saved differently than we are today. Because of the conversation we've just had, I hope you can see this. To participate in this is to know this. I hope you get that. To participate in the Old Testament ceremonial law was to grant and know the Messiah was coming and full redemption is in Him.
That's right.
Do you get that?
They look forward to,
Yeah.
to that.
So the law, get this, the law was set up so that in Christ all sin could be forgiven. Some people might say, oh, they were saved through the law. Or they were saved because of the Lamb they saved. And then now we're saved through Jesus. No. This whole thing, anything that happens, sins are rolled over in the hope that, understanding that, knowing that the Messiah is coming. So all salvation, all for atonement, all forgiveness of sin, praise Jesus, is in Him and Him alone. Isn't that awesome? Man, that's so good.